Yes, so he will do that. And oh yes, you're turning it on. I don't need to turn it on. There's so many pictures of you doing this. Oh hi. Oh good. I'm on this. So anyway, I think, is that all that I need to say? Other than if you gentlemen would just introduce yourselves a little more, that would be appreciated. And we will keep filtering in. Hi Joey, hi everybody. Because it is cold and it's snowy and there isn't a lot of parking, so, and it's Georgetown, so we kind of just come in from time to time. But I look forward to hearing this. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to turn the speaker on now. Would you like the light on the podium?
That's fine. That should be okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Where's the little clicky thing? Here we go. All right, well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I know it's a cold night, so thanks for venturing out here. My name's Ben Perlmutter. I work for Centennial Archaeology in Fort Collins. We're a private consulting company. We do mainly archaeological surveys, so most of our time is actually spent walking around and looking at the ground. Contrary to popular belief, we do very little digging these days. So a project like this is really cool, so I'm really happy to come here and talk to you guys about it. So we're going to talk about the results of an excavation we did last winter. Was it last winter? Winter of 2023, fall of 2023, along I-70. The project was... So we're just going to jump right in here. Before we do, first of all, we can keep this informal. This is a sort of modified version of a talk that we put together for some academic conferences. So please do not hesitate. Don't feel shy. Raise your hand. Interrupt me. I don't care. Ask questions. It's fine. I'll try not to ramble on too much. But again, if I'm talking about something and you're not sure about what the jargon or the terminology, just ask. That's fine. And we'll talk through it all together. But I will try to sort of explain everything as I go. I don't know how much everyone here knows about sort of the prehistory of this area or prehistoric archaeology in general.
Not much.
Okay, we'll start there.
It's mostly recent history.
Yeah, and we will sort of start to get into that. And actually, I hope some of you may have some clues as to sort of the historic element here at this site. We're going to be talking about the deeper history, spanning about 8,000 years. But the site does touch into late 19th century use. So maybe some of you guys will have some ideas of some of that history. So originally, we're just going to jump in here. The site we're talking about is located, it's at the base of Floyd Hill, where they're doing all of that construction. If you've driven I-70, you've basically driven right over it. I'm not allowed to tell you exactly where it is, but we'll say it's at the base of I-70. If you've driven the highway, you've crossed the site. It was originally, the history of the site as far as archaeological research there goes back to '89 when a couple archaeologists from CDOT were out there doing survey for an earlier iteration much earlier iteration of the Twin Tunnels project. I don't even really know what they were doing at that point, but they were doing some survey back there at that time, and they found the site. So, the initial recording of the site was really sparse. They found a couple of stone prehistoric tools on the surface, and then there was this historic foundation, which was here, and a couple sort of alignments of rock, some sort of collapsed building, and then a couple prehistoric tools on the surface. There was not much there, but the archaeologists who recorded the site could tell based on the sort of the soil deposition, the depositional environment, that there was a good potential for there to be artifacts buried under the ground. So a lot of, like I said, a lot of what we do, we look for stuff on the surface. And sometimes you'll find environments or locations where you can tell there's going to be a lot of soil, and there's a good chance when an archaeologist sees an area like that, they're going to sort of get their hackles are going to go up, their antennas are going to start going off, because there's a good chance, if it's a good location like this one is, that there's going to be something buried there. In this case, the site was located on an old river terrace basically overlooking Clear Creek. So it would have been right along the river at one point, and the river in that area has kind of been channeled around as the highway's been constructed over time. But they went back because they had a hunch that there was going to be stuff there. They dug some test excavation pits, 2 units. When we say unit, I mean a 1 by 1 meter square hole, and then a couple sort of more informal shovel tests where you're just basically digging a pit down, screening the dirt for artifacts, that sort of thing. And they found stuff. They found some projectile point remnants. They found pottery, and what they really hit that really got them interested was they hit a layer of very dark, ashy soil, and that would be kind of this one right here, level 3 in these diagrams. So they basically hit a level where you start seeing artifacts popping up. It's a lot of charcoal, a lot of ash, a lot of burned bone. And that alone was enough to sort of say, this is a site, there's going to be some intact stuff buried here. And that was enough to evaluate it as historically significant or eligible for the National Register. And based on that, they avoided the site. They avoided the site for almost 35 years, until they could not avoid the site anymore.
I have a question.
Sure.
About the word terrace.
Yeah.
You use the word does that imply a man-made? You said overlooking the river?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. No, we're talking about like a natural river terrace. So as a river, there's a couple different types of terraces, which sort of does play into this. You have cut terraces and you have fill terraces. Cut terraces are formed by rivers eroding down. Fill terraces are formed by sediment overflowing during flooding events. So, but no, we're basically, it's kind of like a natural landform overlooking a river. So yeah, not man-made, but a natural river terrace. And typically a nice flat spot with good sun exposure along a permanent source of water is going to be a good place for people to hang out. It would be a nice place now, and people need water, people need sun, people need food. So hanging out along rivers is a pretty popular thing to do. So does that answer your question?
It does, pretty much.
Okay, cool.
98%.
All right, well, if there's a 2% we can get to, let me know. Okay. So once it was clear that they could not avoid the sites, the CDOT and the SHPO, which is State Historic Preservation Office, came to contacted Centennial, and we developed a mitigation plan so that we could mitigate the impacts. When it's clear that you can't avoid an archaeological site anymore, avoidance is always our first choice. But when you can't avoid it, you have to do something to mitigate the damage to the site, the loss of data, the loss of information, the damage to the artifacts. And that's the goal, is to sort of come through and figure out, when they destroy the site, what are we going to lose, and how can we sort of collect the information that would otherwise be lost? And that's where excavation comes in. I said we don't do a lot of excavation. It's expensive. It's time consuming. People avoid it if by all means necessary, unless they can't. So here we go. So we came through, and in the fall of 2023, excavated, let's see, 40 square meters? Is that right? 43 square meters of the site. And we also recently got a drone to play with, so we were able to collect some of these images. This is sort of not at the end of the excavation, but towards the end. And one thing to pay attention to is this. You can see, I talked about that dark layer of soil, and you can really see it very nicely in some of these images.
Wow.
And that's not something you normally see in the soil profile, in the soil column. That's enough to say, whoa, that's something.
So is that like a fire pit in the middle of that one that's deep?
Right here?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Actually, good eyes. We're going to get to that one actually in a little bit. But yes, this is a hearth feature that was excavated that we scooped out the fill from. But we have another one of these cool little animations of that feature.
Was the site paved? Looks like concrete there.
It dug like concrete at times. No, it was not paved, but it was super, super rocky. I mean, you can see in some of these images the piles of rock that we were pulling out as we were digging. I didn't really dig a lot.
And
of
where
this
did
site.
all the rock debris get moved to? Did you move it outside?
Basically it would just get piled on the side of the units. So once we sort of determined that it's natural rock, it's not part of a cultural feature, which again we're going to get to in a little more detail, then you just sort of pull it out and you keep digging because you got to pull it out as you go. You're not going to dig around it unless like you can see some of these big honkers. You're not really going to pull that out.
It's your furniture.
Yeah. So, excavation results. We expected we were going to find stuff. We did find stuff. There were 5 thermal features. We're going to talk about those in a little bit, but those are hearth features, either fire pits, earth ovens, that sort of thing, debitage.
What is debitage?
We're also going to get to that soon
Okay.
as well. That is a great question. And we, again, like I said, some of these slides were made for other archaeologists. So again, thank you for asking, and I absolutely will explain that. Flaked stone tools, pottery, cobble tools. So all of this stuff is going to get explained. Let's skip over this slide.
So the stuff that you had in that list.
Yes.
Is that like Native American, evidence of Native American activity, or was it even older than that?
No, this is all Native American artifacts. These are all, we'll talk about the chronology of the site in terms of how long we think it was occupied. But yeah, it's been occupied for about at least 8,000 years, up until and maybe through the period of European contact. So yeah, a very deep history. Definitely all Native American occupations. So yeah, thanks. That is a good question. So features. What is a feature? When an archaeologist talks about a feature, we're talking about something. It's not an artifact. It's not something you can collect and pick up and take home, put in a museum. It's something that's constructed. It's built. It's part of the site. It's part of the landscape. And a lot of what we find as far as features on prehistoric campsites are fire pits. And these aren't just like rings where people built a fire and sat around. They may have very well been doing that, but a lot of times what you see are these scooped out basins, and they're more likely used as cooking features. So yes, you may have sat around a nice campfire, but they're more in terms of earth ovens, that sort of thing. You would build a fire, put a pile of rocks on it, get the rocks really hot, and then you have these food products, either most likely plant products, roots and that sort of thing, maybe meat as well, but a lot of times we're talking about plants that needed heat to process to extract the nutrients to make them digestible. And so, especially before pottery shows up, the only way to sort of cook them was by building these earth ovens.
And in what sense were they bisected?
In terms of here?
Well, every one of them says bisected.
Oh, yes, good eyes. Yes, so when we find a feature like this, and once you sort of see the outline and you can tell that you do have a feature like that, what we do is we dig them. We don't dig them out all at once. We'll sort of draw a line down the middle and excavate half at a time. And that way you can see a profile of the feature. You get to see what the interior of the feature looked like in cross-section. And it allows us, we can draw a nice map of the feature. We can do a nice cross-section drawing, and that's just a part of the records that we keep as we excavate features.
Ben,
So
I'll
you-
stop you for 1 second. Just
Yeah.
one thing that occurred to me that we don't really explain in this one, because we did do it more for a lot of archaeologists who already. Yeah, well, they understand the gridded technology. So when we want to excavate a site, we have to come up with a systematic way to pull all the information out so we can code it so that when we go back to the lab, we can look at the spatial organization of the site across the surface. So what we do is we generate a grid across the entire site, and that grid is metric, and we base it on meters. And then within each 1 meter area, which is about a yard by a yard,
Yeah.
we can measure northings or eastings from grid lines. So we can measure over or up to figure out, okay, well, this artifact came from 40 centimeters north and 30 centimeters east of the edges of our grid. So that when we're done, the whole thing we can look down on it and see where everything came from. And then we also, of course, measure it out going down in depth. But when we hit like a feature like Ben's talking about here, we'll be excavating down in increments of like 10 centimeters. We would pull out 10 centimeters. When we hit like a stain that we think might be like a feature, we'll start to see an outline. It's kind of like, well, is this an outline, or am I coming down on just some big amorphous charcoal stain? And as it becomes more and more clear, then we stop. We clear everything off so we can see the thing from plan view, looking down on it. And that's when we get to this bisecting part, is that next stage. So we have to like
That makes sense.
see it from the top down first, and then try to figure out what its depth and character would be from the profile. So,
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
what Chris isn't telling you is sometimes you bisect it and you're like, oh, that's not a feature.
Yeah.
That's nothing. So a lot of ways it's a good way of confirming that what you're finding is actually what you suspect or hope it is. So yeah. And it's interesting too, Chris is talking about the spatial patterning, the horizontal distribution of where artifacts are. Features are really nice structures of human activity. So even though these might not be sort of what we conceptualize as fire pits, they are still areas where people are sitting around doing things. And so you find features, and around the features you often will find a higher density or higher concentration of artifacts, which sort of indicates that people were sitting around that area doing things. All right, here's that animation I was talking about. So you can see what it looks like before excavation as it's sort of been cleaned off. And then,
Okay, that's cool.
and that's what it looks like after it's been sort of fully scooped out, bisected, both halves have been dug out, and you can sort of see some of the remnants of charcoal inside of it after excavation.
Can you go back and do that again?
Sure.
Yeah. Let's
That's
go back and forth. and
That's
back and
cool.
forth.
Wow.
Let's see. There we go. Yeah, some of this is drones, and a lot of this is actually done with an app on our phones. It's pretty wild. The technology has come. It really has come a long way, and that we don't get a lot of chance to do excavations like this, so it's fun to play with sort of the tools that are available to us. That honestly, even when I was doing my training, my education in archaeology many years ago, this was not this is not how we were doing it. It was not done this way. We'll talk about this just briefly. Feature 8 is kind of an enigma for us. So, structures, architecture. Prehistoric people didn't always live in what we think of as teepees. Those are more out on the eastern plains, highly nomadic people. In areas in the mountains, what a lot of times people would do was dig out a basin, and over that they would build a superstructure of branches, twigs, sometimes clay would be packed on, sometimes hides. But what remains, what archaeologists find are basins. We call them basin houses. Very interesting, very cool, very significant part of the site, if that's what it is. Unfortunately, what we found at this site was what looks like a basin, but because the fill of it was not distinguishable from the rest of the site, it was all this sort of dark, ashy stuff. It's really hard to tell if, oh boy, we got another one. It's hard to tell if this is actually the remains of a basin house or if this is just sort of a natural concavity in the ground surface that's sort of filled in with a little bit more of that dark soil. I wish we knew. It's one of those things, there's no way we could have detected it as we were digging these units down, because normally you find a basin house, you can tell because the fill is different, but in this case the fill, and that just means the soil that you're pulling out from the feature, it wasn't different, so there's just no way to know. It's worth mentioning. There's not much more I can say about it than that. There was a hearth feature right about here at what would have been the bottom of it, which is a compelling piece of evidence that it may have been, but it's not enough for us to sort of publish that this was a basin house. So that's kind of all we can do is say, maybe. So now we can talk a little bit about chronology. Chronology is just the history of when people were there, how long they were there, sort of in terms of prehistory, when did people live there? So we collected 19 charcoal samples from both features. So when you have a feature, that's great. That's what we want, because the charcoal from a feature is tied directly to an episode of human activity. Sometimes we'll find charcoal that's not part of a feature. We're just finding it in the soil that we're excavating. And that's a little more wishy-washy, because it could be soil from a cultural occupation that sort of blew out of the feature. It could have blown in from another wildfire. It could come from any number of things. It could be from a cultural occupation, but it's not really associated with that time. Soil gets mixed up. We have freeze-thaw sort of pulling stuff up and down. So the reason I highlighted these clusters of dates is because those are ones that are tied to specific periods of occupation. So we know exactly that people were there then. But we do have dates that span as far back as almost 8,000 calibrated years before present. So radiocarbon dates, we calibrate them because, boy, radiocarbon dates are tricky. I don't fully understand them. The calibration curve, depending on how far back, they're based on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and that fluctuated through time. So depending on how old the sample was, it may be more or less precise, and so that's why we calibrate them, and that's why we present dates as far as a range, because it's not one date. It's what we can say is that, within a certain level of confidence, 90% that the date happened between this period of time. But all of this, we can sum this up by saying people have been coming back to this site for a very long time, and they've been coming there over and over and over again. And what's cool, we'll talk about this on the next slide, is the diagnostic artifacts. Oh, here's a picture of the excavation. What are my notes for this slide? This is basically just a really good picture of what that dark lens of soil looks like here. You can see it in all of these units. And we found this dark soil all the way across the site.
So is that brown soil on the top? Not on the very top? Yeah. Is that about a foot, roughly?
It varied. It was about 20 centimeters?
I'd say at the deepest probably 20, probably more like between 10 and 12 as you go up the slope, it gets a little shallower, but it varied.
And how much is 20 centimeters in inches?
It's tough because most archaeology is done metrically.
Yeah. Just eyeball it.
About 8 inches?
I don't know. 20
Okay.
Okay.
No.
Foot-ish.
Okay,
The math is hard to math at this point.
so roughly 2 to an inch.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one thing that is interesting, though, is we were wondering if this dark lens sort of corresponded with a period of time. Do the older artifacts found below here, and the more recent artifacts are found above here? That was one of our sort of research questions we were hoping to get at. And one of the issues is that you do have intermixing, especially in this level. This is sort of where the bulk of the historic artifacts, your nails, your glass, that sort of thing were coming out of. But you have prehistoric and historic materials that sort of, especially in this sort of transitional zone here, we're definitely mixed up. So, yeah, again, this is that line we were sort of looking at, sort of exploring if that corresponded with a period of time, a break in the time. All right, debitage, here we go. I told you we'd talk about it. This is really like the meat and potatoes of prehistoric archaeology, especially hunter-gatherer archaeology is what we do in this part of Colorado. We never had agriculture. We didn't have settlements like you see in the Southwest. But even there, people made stone tools. So you think of an arrowhead, but it wasn't just arrowheads. Basically, you would carve knives, tools that you'd use for scraping hides. All of that stuff would be flaked from a piece of stone, not any stone. It had to be what we would call cryptocrystalline, which means it has the properties of glass when you flake it. There's a whole, we're not going to get into that. But so you want really nice fine grain rock, and it doesn't come from, you can't just find it anywhere. There are certain sources where people would be quarrying these rocks from. They look different depending on where it was found. So not only can we tell a lot about what types of tools people were making, we can tell about where they were getting the stone to make the tools. So debitage is, I'm getting ahead of myself here. It's the debris from making a stone tool. You have a rock, you're knocking chips off as you're shaping it into whatever you want to make. The chips that you knock off is what we call debitage. And I say it's the meat and potatoes because a lot of times that is all we find at prehistoric sites in the West. A lot of times people may not have stayed in a place long enough to build a fire or to sleep there, but they may have stopped, made a tool, or taken a tool that was already there and sharpened it, sort of fixed it up. Maybe it was broken and they were reworking it into another tool. So again, a lot of times that is all we have to work with. And so there's a lot of sort of cool questions you can address and talk about just from these sort of flakes, the chips that come off of it. We can talk about what types of tools were being made. How long were they staying there? The amount of debitage accumulates over time. If they were there for a very short time, you're going to have fewer flakes. If they were there for long times or people were coming back over and over again, you're going to have more. It's very obvious, but that's the sort of correlation that we're looking at when we sort of start studying debitage. And then where were they getting the stone? Was the stone coming from up in the mountains? Was it coming from out on the plains? That will also tell us a lot of questions about where people were coming, where they were going, where were they coming from. Trade interactions is another thing you can get at with debitage. We found one piece of obsidian at the site. And obsidian is cool. You can source exactly where obsidian comes from based on the sort of chemical signatures of the stone. And it was sourced to Teton Pass, Wyoming. So that is a good distance. Is it people who walked all the way there and back? Probably not. It's probably, yes, exactly, traded from groups down the line. I mean, obsidian from this part of Wyoming is found as far east as Cahokia outside of St. Louis. So that material was highly valued and it travels far. It's interesting because from this part of Colorado, the map doesn't show it, you're kind of halfway between two big obsidian sources. You've got the Valles Caldera in northern New Mexico, so this sort of corner of New Mexico, we find a lot of obsidian from here and we find a lot of obsidian from here. So we're always wondering sort of which direction was this coming from. So any questions about debitage before I move on?
Is there another name for chert? What's chert?
Chert, yeah, chert is jasper, flint, that sort of.
Nodules and sandstone.
Yeah, so it's very fine-grained rock. It's very smooth. Again, it fractures like glass. You want that because when you knock it, it breaks predictably. When you hit it at a certain angle with a certain amount of force, you know it's going to create a flake of this size. So yeah, we say chert, jasper. What are some of the other terms for it? Chalcedony and chert are basically the same thing. Chalcedony, so archaeologists use these terms incorrectly, but chalcedony, when we say chalcedony, we just mean it's a fine-grained cryptocrystalline material that is translucent. Chert is opaque. That's that's kind of it.
And is chert native to the area where you were doing it?
It is not.
Oh.
It is not.
But you didn't source it, huh?
Look how much.
So yeah, that thanks. I was gonna miss talking about that. A lot of the chert that we find at the site looks like Kremling chert, which comes from Middle Park. The troublesome formation is the technical name for the geologic formation where it comes from, but we call it Kremling chert because it just outcrops all over the Middle Park Basin. It's a very nice material. It really grades in quality, but it can range from almost very opaque white to very translucent gray, maybe even some brown tones in there. It's pretty distinctive, but that was kind of the bulk of what we found was troublesome formation or Kremling chert. So to us, that tells us that people may have been coming down from spending time in Middle Park and traveling down to this site. A little bit of petrified wood. That's also interesting because it's also not native to that area. The closest source of petrified wood from the site is the Palmer Divide, Parker, that area. And there's a lot of petrified wood that outcrops here. As the crow flies, and even just walking distance, it's not that far to get to. So what that tells us, what's really interesting about that, is you have movement down and up passing through this area. And that's sort of a really cool point that we'll talk about again later on.
Another question?
Yes.
On that list of debitage, is there any particular order to the, is it ordered, like, say, according to hardness?
Oh, up here?
Yeah, I'm just asking, is there any order top to bottom to that?
Looks
list?
alphabetical to me.
It's in order.
Yeah, not necessarily any order, but you can see that, this was the favored material. This is just getting into the sizes. The smaller the size, the more sort of later in the stage of making a tool that it's most likely coming from. When you're first starting out, the flakes are bigger. As you're working on a finished tool, the flakes are smaller. So again, when we look at the size grade, that's kind of what we're sort of looking at there. Here's just some examples of the tools that we found. Here's a biface. A biface is a class of flakestone tool that we use to say that flakes were taken off of both surfaces, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you might have a rock and you might just be knocking flakes off of one side. A biface is a tool where flakes were knocked off of both sides. And they can be big and blocky, or they can be really nice and thin, like this just absolutely gorgeous knife that we found. This is made from a quartzite. Super thin. I mean, this is a really, to get up, I've tried flint knapping. I stink at it. To get something this thin takes a lot of skill.
Is that used for scraping hides?
This is used for scraping hides. Probably a knife, maybe handheld. This is big enough, it could have been handheld. A lot of times, we have to assume it would have been hafted into some sort of stick, a handle of some sort. What you see here, this is what we would call, this is a classic sort of textbook end scraper. Scraper, meaning that you don't have flakes taken off of the bottom part, but all of the flakes are taken off of this top part, and that creates a very, obtuse edge, not acute, so not sharp. You have a very steep angle, and that is really good for pushing against a piece of skin and scraping all the fur and flesh and gunk off as you're processing hides. And you can even see it, we don't have the artifact here, but as you can see, you can look at the piece and see like that this edge right here at the end here is really polished, it's rounded, it's smooth, and it really shows from just repeated use against a piece of hide or leather. Really cool stuff. This is a really nice one. This,
I can't read the numbers. What is the size? What size is it?
This is a good chunky size. This is 60 right here. So it's just under 60 millimeters, 6 centimeters. So it's probably about that big. This one is over 10 centimeters, close to 12 centimeters actually. I always think this one looks like a nose, but it's a drill. what we think of as, what we would classify as a drill, which is also a type of biface. Probably this thick end would have been stuck in a handle. This skinny end would have been used for perforating some sort of, it could have been wood, it could have been bone, it could have been hides. Hard to tell, especially since we don't have the tip. And then here's another good example of a bifacial or a biface knife. So a good sort of sample of the types of tools that we found. Projectile points, everyone loves these. They're fun to talk about, they're fun to find, they're just cool. What's neat about projectile points is just like automobiles, they change through time. You can look at a car from the 50s, you know it's from the 50s because of the way it looks. And you can tell from these points when they were made based on sort of these styles. And we know that from a history of archaeology when these were found in dated context, and you know that this point was found in contexts that date to the early Archaic period, or about, I'm going to just grossly generalize, but let's say about 7,000 years ago. This is Middle Archaic, so about, again, generalizing 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. We've got Late Archaic, about 3,000 years ago. Here, another Late Archaic guy here. And then these guys are all Late Prehistoric or Ceramic period, named because that ceramics showed up in Colorado about 1,800 years ago. It also corresponds, this is kind of my master's thesis, corresponds, well not this, but I talked a lot about early ceramic archaeology. Pottery and the bow and arrow showed up at the same time in Colorado, most likely through sort of transfusion of knowledge, probably from the east, because the pottery we find, we'll talk about this in a little bit, resembled Eastern pottery, not Western pottery. But they showed up at the same time. We know the bow and arrow showed up because all of a sudden the projectile points got really small. And you start seeing more of them. These are classic, we call these almost, sometimes you could call these hogback points in this part of Colorado because they're found so commonly in the, sort of along the Front Range here, but they're really found all over across the West, and the time frame is pretty consistent.
So these were all found at that?
Yep, these are all from the Twin Tunnels site. Again, early Archaic.
Wow.
We would call this a Mount Albion point because they name points after sort of the first site that they're discovered at. And the Mount Albion site is up in the Indian Peaks Wilderness, kind of up west of Boulder. Again, pretty diagnostic of the early Archaic. This is just a classic Mount Albion style point. And then moving through, we've got early, middle, late Archaic, and then late prehistoric. And these sort of little tiny tri-notched points, they sort of showed up around about 500 years ago and were used up until the period 300 years ago. So again, really deep time span, just represented by these projectile points, or middle ceramic, we might call that.
So how were the early archaic and the earlier ones used? What kind of tool or weapon?
Oh, that is a really good question. Most likely, so it's dart technology. Whether it was a hand-thrown dart, maybe, thrusting, maybe, but most likely they would have used an atlatl, which is a neat little device. It's basically a stick, and you use it and it gives you leverage. So instead of what you can throw with your arm, use this stick and it flings a dart, a spear. They're really fun. If you ever get a chance to.
Park.
What's that?
Like the dog
That
park.
actually that's the exact same concept. It really is. And it's crazy. Like you throw a spear, you can throw it only so far, but with an atlatl, you really can just huck those
And
things.
the atlatl darts might be 2, 3, 4 feet long. They can be quite a bit bigger. And then when you get down to the arrow, we can be fairly short, up to a foot and a half.
So these weren't lashed onto something. Yeah, I thought that's what the grooves were. in
They
some of the-
were. They absolutely were, and they would have been attached to actually a foreshaft. Typically, not the whole spear, but you would have had these detachable points. The shaft itself was the most valuable, hard to manufacture part of the toolkit. These points are actually not that hard to make, and you can make a lot of them, but the wooden shaft was a lot more valuable. And so most atlatl and dart systems would have had a spear shaft and then a tip that was sort of, and this would have been lashed with like a mix of sinew and mastic, sort of like sappy type mixture to a tip that then you could sort of tie on. So when this broke, you didn't have to make a whole new set. You could just take the tip, tie it onto tie it onto the shaft that you already had. Groundstone, another really cool element of prehistoric technology. I really like groundstone. So what you have is you have cobbles and you have tablets. Monos is the handstone, metate is the flat tablet. Processing plants, you take a root, you take a seed, whatever you need to grind up into a powder to make it edible, digestible, to make it something you can cook. Sometimes even meat, you'd use it to grind up meat and fat to make a pemmican mixture. And you would take a tablet like this and a cobble like this, mash it up. But all we found are these cobbles. Now, I get that doesn't sound that remarkable, but to not find we did not find a single metate fragment. We found one. Okay, we found one. That's especially notable because lion sandstone from the hogbacks outside of all the way along the front range, the Lions Formation is this really lovely red sandstone. They built the CU campus. The CU campus is basically built out of it. We still buy it for our gardens and landscaping today. They're still quarrying it. And this stuff shows up everywhere on prehistoric sites. They loved it. They used it as much as they could. It was really nice to work with. It was really widely available. And the site, as the crow flies, or not even as the crow flies, just walking, is really close to it's right outside of Morrison, actually, if you were walking west. It's not that far. We should be seeing lots of it, and we weren't. Not a single piece of lion sandstone. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. But again, a pretty remarkable thing. And most of these cobbles were very lightly used. Only a couple showed heavy grinding. And I think it's because it's right on the river, so you have an unlimited supply of these nice rounded alluvial stream cobbles right in the stream there. You didn't have to carry your rocks around with you. You pick it up once, you use it, you throw it out. It's not going to develop a lot of heavy wear, but we know that they were used by people because these rounded cobbles are not natural to the soil at the site. They might be in the river channel right next to the site. But if you see a rounded cobble, in the context where we're excavating, a person brought it there. There's no way that it could have shown up naturally. Pottery is awesome. We call it the early ceramic period because that's when ceramics show up in the archaeological record, but it's actually very rare. The pottery that people were making at this time, it was low-fired, it was sort of pretty crude. I don't think, it just didn't preserve very well. So you don't see it very much. We found 81 pottery sherds here, which based on sort of how they looked, the attributes of the sherds, we were able to group into two groups, two of which had this weird lug attached to it, and I don't know what it was, maybe some sort of a grip or a handle, but there was basically a band of clay attached to the sherd. I have pictures of it, we'll get to it. So, group one. These are what we would call, this is classic early ceramic pottery for this area. This looks exactly like pottery from the Plains Woodlands to the east. And that's why initially when this period of time, or this sort of culture was defined in this area, they called it Plains Woodland because this looks so much like the pottery you get at the eastern edge of the plains or even in the eastern woodlands. And so it's these sort of thin sherds with these sort of grooves on the outer surface. The groove was made from basically taking a stick, a paddle, something like that. You wrap it with cords made from sort of plant material. You're twisting up grasses, something like that. And they're paddling the outside of the pot. There's a lot of theories. Is it to grip it? Is it to sort of help fuse the pieces of clay together as you're making it? I think it's the latter. I think it's a manufacturing technique, maybe even decorative. Here we go, and this is a really cool close-up image of what the early, you can really see the cord impressions from when the sherd was manufactured. Sometimes you can even see the twists in the cordage. I don't know if you can, how clearly you can see it, but you can see the actual twists, and watch this. It really gives you a good view of what these look like up close. And this is a rim sherd, so this is from the actual rim of the pot. Only 2 rim sherds were found. The second group of sherds, and here's that lug. You can see it here that I was talking about. These are much thicker, much coarser, much cruder, not nearly as well made. These are middle ceramic, so middle ceramic through contact period is when this was from. So you have 2 types of pottery that date to different times, different occupations, which is also really cool. Another evidence that people were sort of coming back here again. This is the most, I'll just note here that this is the most common type of pottery found in the mountains. There's been a lot of stuff, this style of ceramics found up in Rocky Mountain National Park and other sites up in the high country.
So what are the dates of those?
Middle ceramics, so you're looking at about 700 or 800 years ago, up through like maybe 400 or 500 years ago. So pretty recent, and these really would have extended into the proto-historic or European contact period. So another cool thing, this is one, we only found one of these. We found a lot of bone. This one piece of bone had been carved into a bead. You can see how it's been sort of grooved and smoothed and tapered into a shape. One theory is that, it could have been sort of adornment, jewelry, that sort of thing, or it could have been part of a game, like a gaming piece. There's a Native American game that was played kind of across the continent, where you had a perforated board or piece of bone, a flat piece with holes in it, a string with these beads attached to it, and then a needle or a pin. Exactly how it was played, I don't fully get it. But these look exactly like those pieces. Some of these were found, there was a burial site found when they were building it was the 470 exchange, where there's the Home Depot, I'm sure you know where.
Down by 285?
Yeah, exactly. And there was a burial there. They found almost nearly identical beads at that site, and those were found actually in association with a double human burial. And then we also found these smoothed pebbles, again, not natural to the area, would have been carried in by someone. Naturally smooth, not like something someone manufactured, but someone picked it up, carried it with them. So again, was it part of like sort of a gaming piece? Something else? Hard to say. We don't know what to do with things we can't attribute a function to. It's one of the great mysteries of prehistoric archaeology. If you can't attribute a function to it, it's ceremonial, which is not actually true. It's kind of a cliche, a joke, but faunal assemblage, that just means bones, bone remains. Most of what we found were historic. They had cut marks on them. There was quite a lot of bone associated with the prehistoric occupation, but it was all very small. Not enough that we can really say a lot about what they were doing, what they were eating. They were eating deer and sheep, that sort of thing, and they were probably not processing it on the site. They were probably bringing the animal already butchered, already cut into pieces into the site that they prepared elsewhere. We weren't seeing any evidence of butchery on the site itself. So that's kind of the takeaway points of the faunal assemblage, especially in terms of the prehistorics. The historic stuff, a lot of cow, a lot of sheep, a lot of domesticated animals. There are no chickens, I don't think. No birds.
You had cows?
Well, again, this was like late 19th century, so I don't know if they had them there. It actually was a ranch. There was a historic ranch on this site as well, but also they could have been just sort of buying their meat and bringing it into the site. Sort of ties more into the mining history of this area. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. We have the corner of a foundation of a building. Not sure what it was.
Or a footer, we don't really, it's hard to say.
Yeah, you have a right angle alignment of rocks. Around it, we found a bunch of glass, a bunch of nails, that sort of thing, which tells us there probably was a building there at some point. Not sure what it was. Ceramic or clay pipe fragments, found a couple of those. Maybe just one. Was it one pipe?
Just the one fragment.
Just the one fragment. But generally, the types of historic artifacts we were finding makes us think that it dates to the late 19th, early 20th century. We even found like a boot heel, buttons, that sort of thing. A musket ball, that was cool. Oh, we did some other pipe fragments. So historically, from what I can tell, what was the name of the mine? Kelowna, the mining camp. Right around, if you look at the old maps, there was a not Kelowna.
You asked me and now I forgot.
It's there's a name of a town near Fort Collins too that has the same name. Anyway, Masonville. There was a mining camp named Masonville right in this general area. So we think maybe this had to do with, I don't know if this was exactly where Masonville was, but it was very, very close to it. Masonville also had a stamp mill. So there would have been a lot of historic mining activity in this area.
Well, and there, right above the site, there was a partial adit for exploratory coal mining. It probably didn't turn out to be much of anything. They just had the beginnings of a, like I said, a rough adit that went into a hillside. And then after they modified it, various other construction projects, there wasn't much left of it. So there really isn't enough of it left for us to see kind of what it looked like on that hillside. As far as the mining, what level of mining was there, but there were like, I don't know, we don't probably have pictures of those, but there's a few like railroad tie nails and things there. They're not associated with other bigger elements, so just a lot of kind of a big distribution of mining related trash and maybe residential stuff.
I mean, I don't need to tell anyone in this room that there's mining stuff is everywhere out here. You know, I mean, it was just like, you can't throw a stone up in the mountains without finding some sort of mining related site or something like that. So we're sort of assuming it may have had a mining function, but don't know that. And again, there was a historic ranch on this property as well, so could have tied into that. These are very cool. These are really, really tiny. I mean, you're talking about just a couple millimeters each, these glass beads. What's really cool about these is these look exactly what are called trade beads, and these were part of, you find these at proto-historic Native American sites, so Native American sites that date to after European contact, where they would have been getting these little tiny glass beads through trade with Europeans that were then integrated into their own garments and jewelry and that sort of thing. I don't know if I've ever been on another site where we found trade beads. They're really uncommon. They're also really tiny. It's crazy that we even found them in the screen, because our screen mesh is the 1/4 inch, and these are smaller than a 1/4 inch. So it's impressive that we even got them. It's kind of,
We did go down to 1/8 inch when we started finding them, but
what, 1/8 inch?
even so, they're still small.
Yeah. It's kind of the only evidence we have of proto-historic occupation. There's that pottery style that sort of overlapped into this time period.
And they could have been historic, and they could not have a Native American.
Exactly. It's inconclusive, but very interesting. Really cool. You don't see these a lot.
So did you find a large quantity of these?
That's all of them.
This was it. It was just 3 beads. So it looks like 6, but these are just sort of the opposite sides of the bead. But yeah, just 3 of them.
That's amazing.
So do you have any possible age for them?
I mean, they would be, so the trade beads date to sort of the last 500 years, probably more recent than that, more like the last 300 years. If it was more recent than that, you know, was it part of the historic occupation, someone's jewelry? It's hard to say, but probably not much older than 300 or 400 years at the oldest. You know, I'm gonna skip over this slide.
Oh, no, please, go back 1 second. Just let me look at it.
Okay, so there's a lot of numbers. I don't want anyone to gloss over. I've been yapping up here
Where's
for a
Magic
while.
Mountain?
Okay, that's a great question. So this is a sample of sites that have been excavated. There's not that many sites in the mountains that have excavation. So we wanted to compare our data with other sites where we sort of have a good understanding of what was happening there. Magic Mountain was located it's still there, right outside of Golden. There was a Magic Mountain theme park there. Porcupine Peak is located just on the other side of the tunnel at the base of Keystone Ski Area, right along the Snake River there. Vail Pass is located on Vail Pass. If you've driven over Vail Pass, the visitor center, underneath the visitor center was a massive prehistoric campsite that went back to 10,000 years of occupation on Vail Pass up there. Huge, really significant archaeological site in terms of our understanding of how Native
They built
folks.
right on top of it.
Yeah.
After they excavated.
Yeah, I mean, it was excavated and then they built the rest area, but really important for our understanding of how people lived in the mountains. Yarmany, off of Trough Road, kind of southwest of Kremling. And then Carter Gulch is right under this chair of Lift 9 at Breckenridge. Oh, is it? No, maybe it's 8. But right under the chairlift, they did the survey back in the 80s when they were building the chairlift, and they found a little scatter. I selected these sites also. They represent a nice range in the spectrum of types of sites. Magic Mountain is a really big base camp. People were spending months there, lots of time there. Maybe they live there over the winter. So you have a really large accumulation of stuff.
Much warmer.
Warmer, yeah, very nice climate there. This one's highlighted because it's hard to compare these numbers when we have such a different amount of square meters that were excavated. You kind of have to equalize it. Vail Pass had almost 500 square meters done. But if you look at just density per square meter, Magic Mountain is just off the charts, super dense, lots of debitage. Again, I said debitage is nice because it accumulates over time. Carter Gulch, a classic sort of short-term hunting camp. Maybe someone just stopped there for a night or two, probably at least twice based on the dates, but again, not somewhere someone spent a lot of time. You have a really low density of flakes. And then we're really on the low end of the spectrum here. We're not super dense. We don't have a lot of stuff. And that's kind of the takeaway from this slide here. We don't need to get into all of this other nerdery.
One quick
Yeah.
add-on would be up in the Waldorf, the U.S. Forest Service discovered a site here in the last year or so. Not to the basin, just above town.
Oh, okay. Guanella, okay.
Anything about it.
Huh, I haven't seen anything about that. And
It's like 13.
I think in that 8 to 10,000 years ago.
oh, wow,
They
okay.
found a nice stone, big point
Oh, boy.
in that area. And
Got
then,
that.
so then I look at this and you go, there's a lot of traveling from Vail Pass down through Breckenridge, down through Keystone. You go up Keystone, then you turn right and you go up over Argentine Pass and you're down into
Totally.
the Waldorf, and then the Waldorf you're walking on down to the twin tunnels.
Absolutely, and I'm really glad you brought that up because what you're talking about are travel corridors, and that's kind of the take-home point here. You're talking about areas, if you're gonna walk from point A to point B, there's an easiest way that you're gonna go. You're gonna follow the passes, you're gonna follow the river valleys. You're not gonna walk, you're not gonna hike your butt straight up a mountain when there's an easier way to, it might be a little longer, but you're gonna follow the path of least resistance. And that's a really good point, that there's a lot of movement around here, and that's why we like to look at debitage, the materials of stone people were using to sort of see where they were coming from. How do we place our site within this sort of spectrum? We have all of these sites are big base camps. These are places where people put a lot of effort into sort of creating a site. They have architecture, they have features. People were building stuff there so that they could spend time there. Carter Gulch is really short term. Someone just stopped, spent a day or two there at most probably. Porcupine Peak, which is along the Snake River, right along Keystone, kind of right in the middle in terms of what type of site it is. The hypothesis is it would have been a summer hunting camp. So folks would have been moving up from the plains, probably, could have been coming down from the west, but it's tough to say. You're sort of in this middle area where you're sort of right between the west slope and the east slope, and there's sort of there's connections in this sort of area to the western slope, to the Great Basin, and to the eastern plains, and that area. It's hard to say, but a summer hunting camp, maybe people came up, it was a base camp, but not a seasonal one, that sort of thing. So people were spending a shorter amount of time here. How do we place our site within this sort of spectrum of the ways people lived in places. And what we think, and our hypothesis, this is getting to we're getting right into what you were talking about in terms of people's travel corridors. It's a rest stop now, and we're saying that it probably was a rest stop then. It would have been a really easy path to follow the Clear Creek Valley from outside of Golden. If you were going from the Front Range and you wanted to go up into the mountains to hunt in the summer, which is what archaeologically we know we know that's what they did. We also know ethnographically from sort of interviews with native folks that their indigenous knowledge says that the mountains were their summer hunting grounds. You would have had to get up there somewhere, and you're going to follow the easiest path you could. Clear Creek, that's a tough one. It really would be a nice corridor from the hogbacks outside of Golden, Denver area, up to the mountains. And from there, you could have gone up to Middle Park. We think they were because of all the Kremlin chert they were finding, and coming back down. We don't think that they were spending a lot of time at this site. We think they were coming there over and over and over again, but not staying for very long. And it wasn't a hunting camp. We don't see any evidence of butchery, of processing. So what was it? It's not a base camp. It's not a hunting camp. It's not a quarrying site where they were procuring stone. We really think that it makes the most sense to think about this site as a rest stop. You would have been stopping there on your way up or on your way down, or both, crisscrossing. Maybe these folks for generations might have followed the same path from the Front Range, from the plains up to the mountains. And that's sort of where this site fits in. And that's kind of our interpretation of what this site was. It was never really intensively used, but we do see, I'm yapping on and on, but, because this is really cool. The late prehistoric period, one of the hallmarks of it, besides ceramics and bow and arrow, was an explosion of population density. We know that because we see a lot more dates from the area, a lot more artifacts, but mostly that we see just a spike in the number of radiocarbon dates that come from the late prehistoric period. And that really could only come from a large number of people living in this area. So you see late prehistoric campsites were just used more intensively. They were reoccupied more, people spent more time there. And once again, we have a lot more evidence of more prehistoric use. It's pretty sparse in the Archaic period. People were coming through, not that much. Late prehistoric period, we see consistent with the archaeology of the entire northeastern part of Colorado, we see a spike during the late prehistoric period. So again, it tells us that there's just more people going up and down. There's an intensification of hunting in the mountains during the late prehistoric period. We see game drives being built up in the mountains. They were built earlier, into the Archaic period, but they really start building tons of these massive game drives up in the mountains to hunt lots and lots and lots of meat all at once. Would have required a lot of people to operate these systems during that time. So again, people are moving up, and lots of them are going up into the mountain during the sort of, say, about the last 2,000 years. So I hope I'm not losing anyone. Yeah.
So I don't want to get too sidetracked.
No,
but
let's get
how
sidetracked.
How does the Vale Pass site fit into this, given the elevation and the harsh conditions up there? It was more occupied, more used than.
It was a base camp. It was a hunting camp, and it's a natural travel corridor. It's kind of a pinch point from people walking from the western slope up to sort of the Blue River Valley, that area. And there's only a certain number of places where you could have crossed the mountains from there. So the Vale Pass, it's the reason they built the highway there. It's easy. It's a natural place to cross the mountains. You've got this nice wide, low area. But Vale Pass was a summer hunting camp. Yeah.
Okay, so it was seasonal.
But the neat thing about Vale Pass is we think people were coming from both directions up to Vale Pass and sort of meeting up there. So you have eastern slope people and western slope people who probably converged on Vale Pass.
And you've got Shrine Pass too, so.
Where is that?
Shrine Pass goes off from Vale Pass over the top.
Oh, okay.
And so, it's a hub
Sure.
a hub of early trails.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of these passes, they're sort of pinch points where they're easiest places for animals to walk, easiest places for people to walk, lots of hunting opportunities. So yeah, they really would have been attractive for people. So I think that is it, but I'm happy to answer as many questions as I can.
So you had said 7,000 to 8,000 years ago.
Mhm.
How does that compare to other mountain sites?
Great question. Vail Pass goes back to Paleo-Indian time. So you have at the very late, at least late Paleo. So we're not seeing Folsom or Clovis up there, but you are seeing the late Paleo-Indian complexes. So more like 8,000 to 9,000 years ago,
Okay.
a little bit older. Maybe earlier, but there's not evidence of it.
Do you have the sense that the mountain valley, as you come up, I mean, now it's got this big old interstate highway on
Sure.
it, and there haven't been opportunities to do this sort of work, but you'd have to look at Empire Junction and say, wow, that would be, you know, another spot for potential. So can we go dig in people's yards? No.
Yeah, I'd love to. The takeaway is if it's a nice place for us to go, if it's a logical place for us to go today, it
Yeah,
would have been back
probably,
then
yeah.
too.
Yeah.
You gotta stand
Is
there.
this site protected at all?
I'll think so. So, CDOT is building the highway.
Yeah.
They're expanding the highway. Originally, the plan was for us to mitigate as much data as we could. And the whole point of a mitigation is, once we've extracted as much data, then they can go in and just take the rest of it. You know, it's an offset. It's not a perfect solution, but you can't dig 100% of the site, how big a site is, where it goes, etc. So you get as much as you can, and you offset the damage to that site. As we're getting into this one, there's two confounding factors. One, the site itself had already been built over probably a large chunk of it, an unknown amount, by the interstate as it is. And so there's just this little remnant that we think might be, it could be the whole thing, it might only be a small fragment of what was there on that terrace dropping down towards the creek. So we got done, we dug as much as we could in the time we had, you know, budgets, it is that kind of a process. And when we got done, we're like, you know, we think there's more data here. Is there any potential to try to protect it? And working through CDOT, I talked to CDOT archaeologist, and he agreed with me. So we ended up, they put additional matting over the whole remaining site. They backfilled over it with a layer of dirt, and then they built up over it for their pioneering roads and haul roads and stuff. So yes, it's kind of protected, but at this point, when the interstate's built, it'll be under the interstate. We can't get back to the data. The data's kind of already lost, you know. But at least they're not bulldozing anything that might have been, you know, let's say 100,000 years from now.
Still,
like, we're going to go back and take all the highways down and look what was there. I don't know. It sort of. It's the long story short.
I want to know, you know, we have the hot springs in Idaho Springs.
Yeah.
And we heard that that was often a gathering place for the
Sure.
Native American for ceremonial or for whatever kind of their spa. And I just wondered if this could have a relationship with that, or if this is too distant.
That's a great
I
question.
suspect were probably those kind of sites under Idaho Springs because of the hot springs.
For sure. I mean, people would have known that they were there, and they would have had to walk to get to there. So, I don't think there's any evidence that people lived around those hot springs year round. That's debatable, but not in this specific case.
That's what we understood it to be.
But yeah, people would have been traveling to the hot springs just like they do today. And again, this would have been a natural, logical, easy way to get to those hot springs from, especially if you're coming down from the lower elevations. So again, you have to just sort of think of it in terms of draws. You know, what are the draws that are pulling people up to the mountains and pulling them down? You've got hot springs, hunting, cooler weather in the summer. All of these things really would have been motivating factors. That's really cool. I had not even thought about the hot springs as a sort of element in the sort of settlement pattern we're talking about. That's actually, that's cool.
Yeah, it is
It's a good
very
thought.
close to their.
It is, you know.
It's pretty amazing though, when you think about this, that this is a low elevation site. Most of the archaeological sites that I've heard of people finding and dealing with here tend to be higher up because they're more protected, and maybe it's a communication tower site or something where somebody gets up there. But this is pretty rare to have somebody looking at a site in the I-70 corridor, and to have it be database.
Preservation along the base of the valley is, I mean, you guys have seen it, it gets hammered everywhere, and it's been getting hammered for
Sure.
200 years. So the first time we recorded this site, my company, would have been in like 1998. So it was, somebody came out in 89, and then we came out in 98, and we came back out in 2010, and then, so all these years, and this is just one of those spots that thankful the landowners, and it just,
It
one
just
of the few
went,
spots that
yeah.
just got lucky.
Yeah,
It
just got left
missed it.
behind.
It's a postage stamp that didn't get destroyed.
Yeah.
So who funded you? Who funded you to do this?
CDOT.
They did, okay, that's what I wondered, it's CDOT.
Via the construction companies, everything, it all flows down.
There are a lot of studies that have been done on the corridor at this point in time on historic structures and other things, but it's just, I mean, I'm not gonna sit here and go, yay, just keep developing I-70, but in a funny sense, this wouldn't have happened without it.
No, definitely.
And that's a good point. I mean, we know the most about archaeology from where there's the most projects. I mean,
Yeah,
the archaeological record in Wyoming is so much more robust just because of oil and gas development.
yeah.
You know, all of that development on federal land has archaeological surveys. So, you know, we just don't have it. All of that stuff sort of fuels our sort of research. And so we know where there's sites where we're paid to look, you know, and it creates somewhat of a bias to some extent because we have data where we look for it. But yeah, absolutely.
But then we can extrapolate out
Once you have enough of it,
studied
yeah.
area here next to an unstudied area,
Sure.
and say, look at all the things we found here. in
Sure,
these
that's a good point.
environments.
Yeah.
We would see these here, and we can point out landforms and kind of.
And
get
like
an idea.
Smokey said, I mean, the travel routes are the travel. When I took Colorado history from Liston up at CSU, he said, okay, early guys coming out here, here's what they did. They came into I-76 to Denver, they hit I-25 to Kansas City, and they took US 50 up, you know, and but he's right. You know,
Yeah.
so.
And I love that because people are people, you know, there's this sort of continuity through time
Yeah.
that connects us.
You're gonna
and
go
I think
along the
that's really cool
waterways,
to think
yeah.
about.
So where is the story of this effort kept? And how can it be shared?
Quietly.
Yeah, so we will produce a report. We have produced a report, and it's sort of in the review process with the agencies, with CDOT, the tribes, and any sort of interested tribes in this area will review it. I don't think that's the process, is everyone who has a sort of vested interest will review the report. It will get accepted. It'll get archived at the SHPO, or the State Historic Preservation Office. Some of the information in the report is sensitive in terms of the actual specific location of where it is. So the question of how can we disseminate this information, some of it is coming and giving talks like this to let people know, but I think that's kind of an ongoing question that CDOT and will sort of want to address is how do you know, part of the mitigation isn't just doing the research, it's sharing the data. If it just lives in a hole, you know, or is archived online and on a data site that only archaeologists can access, you know, what's the point, you know? So that's kind of an ongoing question that I would love to see developed. I would love to see this sort of data presented more widely.
We're in talks. I mean, there is a rough idea that CDOT may host a website that would have information about this site on it. I'm not the arbiter of that, I don't get to decide any of those things, but if it all goes forward, we'll give them the information and help them craft it so they can be a website that anyone can get to and review
So
themselves.
like our state historical society or something.
Yeah, well, and they do a lot. A lot of times, prehistoric sites are their specific site locations are redacted, but the bigger picture, the information, the story it tells, gets told through their studies and their museums. But yeah, we're in. That is an ongoing discussion. I think it'll happen, and I just don't know.
It's so great that you guys came up to tell us about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we?
Oh, we're staying here tonight.
Oh, okay. In the next few days.
We looked at the weather forecast, we're like, nah.
We're used to snow up here. I think Denver gets landlocked faster than we do.
Yeah.
My husband was a firefighter in South Metro, and he always made it to work, and sometimes.
I don't mind the weather, it's the people. It's the other drivers that I like to avoid.
Well, listen, thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Thank you.